Hello and welcome to another edition of Be Still My Soul. And today we're in Psalm 85. Now, the Christian faith in this country is at a really low ebb. I don't know what percentage of people actually attend church regularly. Maybe it's 5%. Churches are closing. The Church of England's in decline. Other denominations have seen a huge decline since COVID. But it was not always like this. In the past, many people in the country attended church. There might have been a time in the 19th century when a third of the country would be in church on any given Sunday, perhaps more. And at times, housing estates would not be built unless a church was built by the builders for people to attend. Well, how might that happen again? How might our country return to its Christian roots? Well, Psalm 85 gives us a framework for our prayers. This psalm was penned at a time of national distress. The country is at a low ebb. People have turned away from God. And God's people gather together and they pray. And in their prayers, they do three things. The first thing they do is they remember God's favour in the past. Verse 1, Lord, you were favourable to your land. You restored the fortunes or the captivity of Jacob. God restored his people. He was kind to them. He was favourable. They'd fallen on hard times and God restored them. He restored them physically by making their land fertile and prosperous again, and he restored them spiritually by giving them his presence. And how did he do that? Well, we're told in verse 2, you forgave or took away the iniquity of your people, and you covered all their sin. God restored his people by dealing with their sin, by forgiving it, by covering it up, literally kind of like making atonement for it. And because he dealt with their sin, God's anger was also dealt with. Verse 3, you withdrew all your wrath, you turned from your hot anger. You see, the ultimate problem was not the people's sin, but God's anger and wrath at their sin. That's our ultimate problem. Our ultimate problem is that there is a God who is angry at sin. But once God has dealt with the sin, forgiven it, covered it, he's got nothing to be angry at. His anger has been removed. Now, remembering the past helps us in two ways. The Psalms again and again call us to remember the past and remember our history. And remembering the past helps us, first of all, because we are able to compare ourselves with the past and see how far we have fallen, see where we've come from. You know, many parents compare the heights of their children with the heights they were in the past. You know, sometimes on the post of a door, they would parents put a pencil line as the children go, and at certain heights they put a line, and then a year later they put another line, a year later they put another line, and you can look back and compare the height of the child today with where they were a year ago or 3 years ago, and they see the difference. Well, looking at the past helps us compare where we are at spiritually with where our country was spiritually 10 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, and we can see how far we've fallen, how far we've moved away from God. But remembering the past also helps us because we see what God can do, how God can restore his people, because he did it back then. And if God did it back then, he can do it today. If God can change lives and society then, he can change lives and society now. So that's the first thing we're to do if we want God to revive us. We're to remember God's favour in the past. But the second thing we're to do is to pray God's character in the present. The psalmist begins verse 4 with these words: "Restore us again, O God of our salvation, and put away your indignation toward us." He outlines the need. And what's the need? Restoration. People have got hard hearts towards God. They live sinful lives, and the result is that God is angry because of the sin. Restoration is what's required. And so he continues with a series of questions, and he continues with these questions because he presupposes that God has a relationship with his people. Verse 5, "Will you be angry with us forever? Will you prolong your anger to all generations? Will you not revive us again, that your people may rejoice in you?" He says, Lord, you love your people. You've got a relationship with your people. Won't you be merciful to them? Won't you restore them? Won't you bring joy out of sorrow and hope out of despair and light out of the darkness that they're in? And at the heart of this prayer is a prayer for God's character to be revealed. Verse 7, "Show us your steadfast love, O Lord, and grant us your salvation." At the heart of a prayer for revival is a cry to God to show his love and mercy. You see, that's what revival ultimately is. Revival ultimately is an experience of God's love and grace, a knowledge of his forgiveness, not just in a person's head, but in a person's heart and in their life. A meeting with him, the living God. And when people meet with him, their lives are changed. Society's changed. We've got some rechargeable batteries at church, which we need to charge up for use with the microphones on a Sunday. Those batteries run down and become dead. And once they're dead, they won't be any good at all until they're plugged into the mains. They need to be plugged into the mains, charged up. And once they're recharged, we can put them in any of the microphones and they will work. In fact, you could put them into anything, and whatever they're put into, they will make work. You see, once we experience God's love and grace, once we are revived personally, then lives are transformed, relationships are transformed, society is transformed, and is transformed by an experience of God. That's what he prays for. And then finally, the psalmist looks for God's restoration in the future. Verse 8, "Let me hear what God the Lord will speak. For he will speak peace to his people, to his saints, but let them not turn back to folly. Surely his salvation is near to those who fear him, that glory may dwell in our land." The writer knows that only God can revive his people. And so, whilst he prays for God to work, he waits on God to work. He listens to his word. He reminds himself that God and his glory dwells near to those who fear him and is far from those who disobey him and turn back to foolish ways. He waits on God. He waits on God to work his work of grace once again. And once he does that, once God does that, once he revives his people, there is spiritual, material, and moral peace once again. Verse 10, "Steadfast love and faithfulness or truth meet, righteousness and peace kiss each other." God's attributes of love and truth, of righteousness and peace are at work restoring his people, leading his people to have peace with God. Not only do they have peace with God, but once his people are right with him, once there's peace with him, then we find material peace as well. Verse 12, "Yes, the Lord will give what is good, and our land will yield its increase." Once there's peace with God, then nature returns to fertility once again. And verse 13, "Righteousness will go before him and make his footsteps a way." When God comes, when his presence comes, so righteousness appears. and his people start walking in right ways. Now the question for us is this: how is that possible? How can God restore sinful people? He does do that. He's done that in the past. He can do that in the future, and we're praying that he will do that again. But how can he do that? How can he maintain justice and forgiveness? That's what he says in verse 11. Truth or faithfulness springs up from the ground, and righteousness looks down from the sky. How can that be? Well, only through Jesus Christ. See, love and truth meet. Righteousness and peace kiss each other at the cross. You see, at the cross of Christ, God exacts justice and punishment for sin by punishing and judging his Son on behalf of his people. And the result of that is that we are forgiven as we put our trust in him. We are restored. We are renewed in our relationship with him. See, that's how God can be just and the justifier of those who believe in Jesus Christ. Let's pray this prayer and ask that God would revive us once more. Thank you so much for tuning in. Till next time, God bless.